Hey, we should talk about the Master Race.
Let's have that conversation.
Yeah. Why don't you tell me a little bit about The Dark Knight Returns? What it is, who Frank Miller is, why is this a thing?
So in order for us to talk about the Master Race, Dark Knight 3, we gotta give a very brief overview of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. So, Dark Knight Returns came out in 1986, and we're not going to go too deep into, the way it shattered and reshaped the industry and stuff, because that's in like every Batman documentary ever made. But it's just important to know that when The Dark Knight Returns came out, it came out in a very specific political climate, which Frank Miller reflected in his writing. It was also one of the many things that was going on in his life that propelled him as a writer to the forefront of comic books. And it also helped elevate the idea that comic books could be read by adults. A bigger factor in that was that people who were reading comic books in the 70s kept reading them as they got older. So I think that one of the ways that The Dark Knight Returns gets framed that's a little wrong is that they say, well, this is what showed, this is what allowed older people to read comic books. When I think that the real reason it went over so well is because older people in high school, early college, were already reading comic books, so they were more hungry or thirsty or whatever for a book that would appeal to their sensibilities. So Frank Miller pumps something out that's very politically aware and brings to the forefront the idea of the graphic novel that everybody's talked about forever. Another important part of understanding the Master Race is Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Strikes Again. The Dark Knight Strikes Again is an official sequel within the Millerverse, meaning using the same character ideas that Miller established in The Dark Knight Returns. He continued on with The Dark Knight Strikes Again, but it wasn't the same approach to storytelling. It wasn't as dense. It wasn't as politically interesting, I guess. And the story was pretty bonkers, pretty off the wall. The art, a lot of people were really critical of the art. I know that a lot of the coloring was being done with computers. It was pretty innovative in that way, but it really upset a lot of people because it looks really strange and flashy and cartoony compared to Dark Knight Returns. So within that context, DC announces they're going to start doing releasing Dark Knight 3, and it's called The Master Race. It was going to be a second sequel called The Master Race. A lot of people were very concerned and upset because in the context of Frank Miller's previous statements, they were worried that, so is he just going all out white supremacy? What's happening? But then it was announced that Brian Azzarello, who had done a lot of stuff for Vertigo, a lot of well-known stuff for Vertigo. He'd written for Batman before an arc that I actually think is really good called Broken City. He had written a Joker graphic novel. Brian Azzarello was going to be co-authoring Master Race with Frank Miller. So that calmed a lot of fears, including mine, that this was just going to be another kind of bonkers, potentially racist Frank Miller book. And it was also announced, interestingly, that Frank Miller would not be the artist.
So The Dark Knight Returns is one of the first comics that I read as an adult, and so it had a huge impact on my comic interests and what I realized that graphic novels could be capable of. It wasn't really as transformative of an experience as, say, reading Sandman or All-Star Superman. So the ending of The Dark Knight Returns left it open, ended with Batman literally going underground and starting a new team of followers. Some of them were pulled from the mutant gang that he fought earlier. So he takes on, and I haven't read The Dark Knight Strikes Again. I tried to. I started it, and I just was really put off by the art and the incoherency of the whole thing. So I didn't feel like it was necessary to finish. And even going into Dark Knight 3, I didn't really feel like I missed much.
So the big thing you would miss from not reading Dark Knight Strikes Again is just that Superman and Wonder Woman have a daughter.
Oh, okay.
And so you've obviously already caught up with that. It's not that hard, but it's
right.
just she plays a kind of a prominent character in Strikes Again.
Yeah. The daughter does?
Yeah.
Or Wonder Woman?
Just the daughter does. Okay. Just the fact that they have this daughter.
Yeah.
So,
and she's named Laura.
Laura, yeah.
After Kal-El's mother.
Is that the name?
I think so. Gosh, I'm going to feel stupid if it's not.
I don't know. So she comes from that, and then also in Dark Knight Strikes Again, it's established that Dick Grayson, I believe it is.
Right.
I
do know this part.
Because, freaked out and became the Joker.
Which, there's a thing where this, originally Year One was supposed to be, also written by Frank Miller, was supposed to be the same continuity as The Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah.
And same with the All-Star Batman and Robin that got not canceled, but just hasn't been finished.
Yeah.
Which, if that's the case, then it makes perfect sense that Dick Grayson as an adult would have this kind of psychological break and PTSD that would turn him in to basically a new version of the Joker, right?
Yeah. Apparently, no one hates Dick Grayson more than Frank Miller. Like, Frank Miller has probably done more to, just crap all over that character than anyone else. For some reason. Who knows why? Yeah. Miller's very committed to the idea that Batman is a huge jerk.
Yeah, not just a jerk, but that he really believes in violence as the ultimate authority. And that's kind of where he gets his power, because he can go out and beat up bad guys and no one can stop him. That just gives him all the power in the world. So that takes us to the Master Race, which when that title was announced, it was really worrying, given Frank Miller's kind of fascism.
And just the trajectory of his work.
Right.
Because I've told you this before, I think people try to backread a little too much. And I think that a lot of his earlier stuff, I'm sure he's cited Ayn Rand as an influence and stuff in the past, but I think that his politics were a lot more complicated when he was writing in the 80s and in the early to mid 90s. And he even wrote certain things that are really easy to interpret as pretty liberal, like his Martha Washington series and stuff like that. Right. And so, but the current trajectory, Master Race sounds like, oh, cool.
Yeah. So I was a little surprised when I finally sat down and read the first 3 issues. The Master Race is actually referring to Krypton.
Yeah.
So what happens is Superman keeps a small, tiny, atomic version of Krypton in a jar somewhere. Which
this is also something that's discussed in Strikes Again a lot.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, and so there is kind of this small Krypton.
It's just basically Superman preserving his heritage through this weird sci-fi idea that is straight out of the Twilight Zone, I think, or at least that Simpsons episode. But what happens is is it the Atom?
The Atom, yeah.
He goes there to visit, just to say hi, just for a chat, and this kind of, he's not Zod, but this Zod-like character just kind of takes advantage of the opportunity and breaks free of the glass jar prison that Superman has put them in, and frees all of these Kryptonians out into the world, and they just start wreaking havoc because they are the Master Race.
So a really important part of understanding the way this story has been set up, spoiler alerts, right?
Yeah.
So the reason that Dr. Palmer goes in to converse with the Kryptonians is because Superman's daughter talks him into it. And she says that they're asking, they're tired of being small, and so she kind of helps course him into going in, and then things go a little bit awry, and they use his power to basically reverse their situation and grow large.
Right.
And then they come. And so you, by the end of issue 3, it's essentially established that Superman's daughter is on the side of the Kryptonians who have an interest in invading Earth.
She's essentially the villain.
Yeah.
So what really jumped out at me while reading this was that, based on The Dark Knight Returns and The Dark Knight Strikes Again, I was really surprised that this is really just kind of a formulaic comic story, like supervillains wreaking havoc, and Batman. Which, by the way, where is Batman through this whole thing? So Carrie Kelly is wearing the bat suit, and she gets arrested at the end of the first issue. She's taken in. She's silent. The new commissioner, who's the same commissioner as the first 2 Dark Knight Returns books, is questioning her, and she just keeps repeating that Bruce Wayne is dead.
Yeah.
Turns out that's not true. He got really sick or beat up.
He's basically on life support.
Yeah, he's on life support, and he's just kind of in a slow recovery. He's got a crutch. So keeping up with this trend of the Dark Knight series, he's getting older, and it's taking him longer to recover from these things, and he just realizes that he's not able to physically be Batman anymore. Carrie Kelly is willing to do it, but he's a little nervous about that because it's a mix of like be out of concern for her and also just like recognizing that her concern for him will be her downfall. So it's more like he's mission oriented. With his nervousness about her being Batman.
Well, and there's this interesting the way that they end the third issue. I believe it's the third issue is Batman. Oh no, I'm sorry. The second issue is that the reason Batman decides, okay, I'm gonna get back into this is because he sees the invasion of the Kryptonians.
Yeah.
And that seems to spark something in him where he's like, this is a job for me and not anybody else. Which I do think throws back a little bit to the Miller-verse. Like, Batman's almost more of like an anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment character.
Right.
And so maybe that kind of triggers this weird thing in him. But it is a lot hazier. It's not like when Miller was doing Dark Knight Returns, the politics are very palpable. Like, you get what he's getting at. And in Master Race, I agree with you that it feels like this is very much just a comic book that's making references to things that are going on in society and pop culture. But it doesn't have like this barreling train power of like, oh, this person is making some sort of statement that I'm interested in getting at and digging into.
Now, what do you mean, though? Because what... Now, is this a thing that carries over from The Dark Knight Strikes Again? Superman's frozen, and when Batman decides to like take on the Kryptonians, like the first thing he does is he goes and recruits Superman, which is also kind of a break from the other Dark Knight books because where they were pitted against each other. Now it at least for the first 3 issues, it sets them up that they're going to work together. To take out this threat. And I'm assuming that later on there's going to be a conflict between them because this is Frank Miller. And this is his.
And Batman and Superman always fight. That does come... So in Strikes Again, there is kind of like a Batman-Superman reconciliation a little bit, I guess. Okay. There's also like this weird moment when Superman's daughter is conceived and it causes like a tsunami in Dark Knight Strikes Again. So there is some of that in there, but the reason it's weird, the Superman thing, even in the context of Dark Knight Strikes Again, I think, is because in The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller is he's basically created, he's situated all of these different characters as archetypes. So Batman represents something very specific, and Superman represents something very specific. He's just like a chump of the government, basically. And there's even that wonderful moment in Dark Knight Returns when the American flag is waving, and then it just like slowly morphs into the Superman S. So there's all there's great stuff like that, and he's very clear about who he's trying to get across. Superman represents. In Strikes Again and so far in Master Race, both Batman and Superman don't seem to represent some sort of political ideal or anything. They're just kind of these good old comic book characters that we're really familiar with and we're glad to see on the comic book page in this way again. But I don't think that it's like I don't know why. It's so much less compelling to have Batman and Superman in the Millerverse like get together and do stuff.
Well, like I said, I'm sure that because this is Superman's daughter who's kind of the instigator, and because these are Kryptonians that they're going to fight, that there's going to be some conflict down the road. So this seems like a good place to start for them to start off working together, and then it's kind of the reverse of where other things seem to go. So ultimately, after reading these first 3 issues, I'm just surprised that it's not really very controversial. It's just kind of a straightforward, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. There's a little bit of politics thrown in, but not a very elaborate political ideology or anything. I don't know. Did you get that same?
Yeah, I basically feel the same way, and it seems like reading these. It seems like what DC's trying to do is they're trying to set up potential for extended like Millerverse,
right?
The potential so they can just kind of write because this Batman as he exists and this Superman and this Wonder Woman, they are actually very distinct from
their mainstream
from their mainstream portrayals. And even their costumes. I mean, Wonder Woman's outfit, where it's kind of like the Spanx shorts, and that's like very. When you see that, you're like, oh, that's Frank Miller's Wonder Woman. So it seems like.
And this version of Superman is just kind of like a. he'll do anything for the. He's just kind
He's
of
a chump.
He's a good Boy Scout. Yeah,
Yeah.
chump. Exactly.
And so it seems like DC sees the potential for convincing other chumps like me who will buy anything that reminds them of things they loved when they were children.
Yeah.
They say, well, if we just, start kind of like a second continuity and just start doing a lot of stuff in the Millerverse. Because beyond this, they're also releasing a graphic novel sometime in the near future. I think the release date's changed, of the story that put Batman into retirement.
Okay.
So they're clearly doubling down in that direction, and that's why I think reading this, it does read a lot less like some sort of cultural touchstone, even like Dark Knight Returns and Strikes Again, where it seems like it was Miller just throwing everything on the table that he could, and in Dark Knight Returns it stuck really well, and Strikes Again it was just like weird and psychedelic. But in this one, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like somebody's really gone out of their way and telling like a really radical story. It feels like somebody's telling a pretty normal Batman story, but they're just doing it with Frank Miller's characters.
Yeah.
Which is...
And also in Frank Miller's style.
Yeah.
And we're taking wild guesses on how much Frank Miller and Brian Azzarello are involved, respectively, in these books. But basically, to kind of sum up, I think, where you were going with this, we have an original work... that was a milestone in comics, then a follow-up by the same creator that kind of tanked the whole idea, and now we have kind of a reworking with some other creative minds to kind of salvage that legacy for a planned extended franchise.
Man, this sounds weirdly familiar.
I mean,
it's almost like there's some other major corporation doing the exact same thing right now.
Weird. I wonder where they got that idea. I mean, not that they got... Yeah. But that's exactly it. Like, it feels very safe.
Mm-hmm.
It's... Which is, again, to say, I don't hate it. I don't...
Yeah.
There's nothing to hate. Exactly.
Yeah.
For a Batman story, it's solid, which was surprising. I was expecting a disaster with a title like The Master Race. It's got, like, a great Superman world. It's merging the two worlds with Krypton and everything, and I love that as well. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I will definitely. I think Brian Azzarello is a good writer, so
yeah.
If you have if they announce in 2 years and they say Scott Snyder is doing, a fourth sequel to, then I'll read it, because I'm like, Scott Snyder's a good writer.
Yeah,
I like the characters in general that Frank Miller's created, so watching Scott Snyder play with Frank Miller's toys would probably be a good read. So yeah, I'm not upset, and I'm not gonna like boycott DC over it, but it also and this is, I think, part of the nostalgia culture that we're in right now,
right?
Is that because we saw this with, I mean, let's just say it out loud now, Star Wars,
right?
Because Force Awakens follows very much this trajectory. I think Force Awakens is a better approach to this, slightly.
Yeah, but again, it is very safe.
And
it got some flack for that.
Yeah.
And
what's the term you used another time we were talking, like brand control? It's like brand control, brand maintenance. It's Star Wars fans were very distraught, no matter what they say now. Star Wars fans were very distraught about how much the prequels had kind of put a bad taste in their mouth in the Star Wars universe. And it's the same with Batman fans and Strikes Again. And so what DC and what Marvel, Disney, or whatever are all doing is they're saying these are really lucrative brands, and so if their creators hadn't gone and screwed them up, then we would have a lot of potential to do a lot with this stuff. And so they're just kind of recorrecting or correcting all these issues.
Now, like Star Wars, this third series is not going to be as transformative as the very first Dark Knight Returns. Just like The Force Awakens was never going to be as influential or as it's not going to scratch that nostalgic itch the way people expect, because it's not the same thing. And there's really good reasons for that, because that was a thing that was breaking away from trends, trying something new. This is a thing that's following that path that's already been laid out. It's just continuing down the road within the same parameters that the original set out. I think you can say that both the same thing for Star Wars and The Dark Knight Returns. So I could see why people might be disappointed in how this story is unfolding and its lack of bite, I guess.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing. I think it's
but another thing that when I return to Dark Knight Returns that strikes me as so remarkable about that book is how cinematic it is.
Yeah.
Because it almost feels like you're reading a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you could say that about like every comic book in some ways. But the way that Miller does it is almost like blatant. That it just feels like you're reading panels in this really exciting movie versus someone like Alan Moore, where I think he was purposefully trying to do stuff that was literary but non-cinematic.
Well, he always had those the talking head things, which I really want to get into because those felt like montages in the middle of the action, to kind of to take a break, almost like a Greek chorus, to kind of describe what's happening. That's still here in the Master Race. However, they're also throwing in, some youth voice, millennial kind of commentary, some tweets going back and forth. However, this is I think out of anything, this is the part that really disappoints me because it's just a very cynical, pessimistic view of millennials or the youth generation because they're just so passive and they don't seem to be very interested and they don't care or they don't understand like these deeper political issues, and I feel like that's just very reactionary and annoying. But you were saying earlier that that's kind of consistent with how the Dark...
Yeah, so the Dark Knight Returns very much, I think, when you read it, because he's portraying the youth culture, it's poking a lot of fun at 80s punk culture and what was going on. And it was portraying youth as like kind of these wandering people that were just in need of direction.
And they needed Batman, this, greatest generation kind of old man to come in and save them.
The Dark Knight Returns is very much like reads as a love song to the greatest generation,
right? And
it kind of poo-poos, if I could say, on the boomers. There's even Carrie Kelly's parents are kind of like these baked stoners who talk about the glory days of the 60s. And so Miller, and that's obviously like some of Miller's conservatism manifesting itself in that way. Yeah. But youth culture to Miller, I think one of the things that is kind of radical about The Dark Knight Returns is that and I can't overstate this, but when I was at the bus stop yesterday, and there was a girl, a student at the university, I'm assuming, and she had a backpack on, and it had like one of those Batman patches, like a big yellow, old school Batman patch, and I just started thinking about how Batman always goes through these waves where Batman is either cool or he is like not cool. And after the 1960s Batman was not like cool. Right. And after Batman and Robin, Batman was very much not cool. Yeah. Those were dark times, and I remember those times very specifically. And but it seems like in order for someone, I just started thinking about what it means to have a bat symbol on your t-shirt or on your backpack. Yeah. Because it's not overtly political.
No, I don't think so.
It's not like some sort of, like, you can't see, like, oh, that person has a Batman patch, so this means something. But I do think it is indicative of some sort of embrace of, like, a youth counterculture. Maybe not counterculture, but, like, it's saying, I read comic books. Or it's saying, I watch movies.
I don't know. Like, it definitely is a symbol that kind of, like, screams out geek culture. But even for that, it's a very not superficial, because there's definitely a lot of depth to Batman, but it's one of the most easily accessible geek culture properties out there because there's so many ways to get into Batman. Like, someone could have a Batman patch on their backpack and only have played the Lego Batman games.
That's true. But I guess that's what I'm getting at a little bit, is that I think if somebody has a t-shirt and they've got a Neil Adams Batman on their t-shirt, I'm like, geek culture. Like, that's like,
they get it.
I don't want not that you get it, but like, that's something different. That's like, I go to the comic book store every Wednesday and pick up my weekly, comics. Whereas I think I think you're right, that a Batman symbol doesn't mean, like, I don't think that means geek culture. I think it just like means something slightly different. Because
you could be a Batman, I'm not trying to like disparage any sort of, like, any level of Batman fan is fine. Like, if you only just have the bat symbol and, could like care less about the comics, like that's fine because he's that kind of a character. He's that kind of an icon.
And so when I think of, I just wonder if that approach to Batman, because it comes from that Miller's kind of the first one that says like you can view Batman that way.
Okay.
Batman, because Miller's like thesis is Batman kicks ass.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like all you really need to know about him. I mean, I don't think that that's actually like in the book. Like, it's a lot deeper than that.
No,
but
you're saying that
as a cultural icon,
that it was Frank Miller that elevated Batman to a cultural icon because his book came out just a couple years, and I think this is important. It came out just a couple years before the Tim Burton Batman movie, which I think is what really set the stage for like a mainstream Batman, at least after the '60s show.
Right. And I'll say this in a more concise way. So, I do think that Frank Miller can be given not all credit, but a lot of credit for raising Batman's cultural status to a very specific place that I think in a lot of ways hasn't ever really diminished. It's had really rocky periods. But in general, when you think of Batman, when you see somebody wearing a Batman t-shirt or having a Batman patch on their backpack, not that you have like broad assumptions about that person,
right?
But you know why they like Batman, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
And so Frank Miller, I think, establishes that kick-ass Batman in Dark Knight Returns, even though, like I've said before, I don't think that he didn't make Batman dark. Denny O'Neil was writing very complicated, psychologically dark Batman. It's just that the iconography that Frank Miller introduced to Batman jumping up with his arms stretched in the air with lightning striking behind it, is so iconic.
Batman on the horse.
Yeah. All these different things. He put Batman in a place where in pop culture he meant something very new and specific and different. And so that is something that hasn't been achieved or changed. And I don't think Master Race it's not realigning, because DC probably doesn't think they need to realign that. They're like, this is fine. Right. We can just keep going with this. So I think that the last person maybe to do that to Batman was probably, Christopher Nolan, but that's different. Movies are a different thing.
Right.
But in comic books, I do think that Grant Morrison changed a lot of public perceptions about Batman, but that's still a lot more comic book narrow. Like if you read comic books, Grant Morrison opened up new avenues for you how to think about Batman.
Yeah. This is a conversation for another time, but Grant Morrison basically married the idea of the campy Batman and the serious dark Batman and put them together, and that's kind of changed how we look at him in the comics. Whereas
Miller, I think, was trying to just erase a certain perception altogether. Whereas Morrison was trying to kind of marry them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. I'm looking forward to the next issue. And me too. That's Master Race for now.